Relatives and close allies of the jailed Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny are demanding to know more about how he died and what has happened to his body. An exiled Russian newspaper is reporting that Navalny's body is held at a morgue around 50 kilometers from the remote penal colony where he was imprisoned. Authorities say he died there after collapsing on Friday. Supporters of Alexei Navalny have defied intimidation and arrests in Russia to stage memorials and vigils nationwide. His allies say Navalny will not be forgotten and his work will live on.
Unknown masked man removing flowers left by supporters of Navalny. Within seconds, new ones appear in their place. Such scenes are being repeated across Russia, with flower kiosks running out of stock.
He was a very strong person. And I think all of Russia is suffering because we lost such a hero.
Supporters have carried on expressing their sorrow and anger despite arrests and intimidation. More than 400 people have been detained since the vigils began on Friday. Why is it important for you to honor his memory?
It's important in the 21st century to live in a democratic country and not in a dictatorship.
Flowers and condolences are piling up also at Russian embassies around the world. In Berlin, members of the punk band Pussy Riot staged a protest, blaming the Kremlin for Navalny's death.
I think it's a big blow for Russian opposition. It's going to be really difficult for us to unite because whether if you loved Navalny or didn't, there were people who disagreed with him on a number of things. He was our guiding star, and people would define their positions and tactics and political views depending on what Navalny does and says.
Navalny's supporters vow to continue his mission, even though hope for change in Russia has faded with his death. At the same time, they say that's exactly what the Kremlin wants everyone to think.
Max Boot is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a columnist for The Washington Post. He's joining us now from New York. Welcome to the programme, Max. Navalny's family are still waiting to see his body. What does this delay tell us about his death?
Well, obviously, there's a cover-up going on by the Kremlin. They don't want us to know how Navalny died, and so it makes a lot of sense to reach the obvious conclusion, which is that he was murdered. I mean, Putin was certainly responsible for his death, no matter what happened, even if it was just of quote-unquote natural causes from being tortured in solitary confinement and sent to this penal colony north of the Arctic Circle. But, I think the fact that they're not releasing the body and they're not saying what the cause of death was, I think that leads us to believe that he probably was outright murdered and probably on Putin's orders.
And we have heard condemnation from world leaders, unsurprisingly, putting the blame on Russia's president. But is there actually a chance that Navalny's death could realistically trigger some kind of action? And if so, then what?
Navalny's death should definitely trigger action. I don't think anything is going to happen in Russia because Putin, his police state is too strong to be challenged right now. But there's a lot that we in the West can do to stop Putin in Ukraine, where he is very vulnerable, where the Ukrainians are fighting very hard. I think two things need to be done. First, there is $300 billion in frozen Russian funds in the West, primarily in Belgium. They should be sent right away to Ukraine so that Ukraine can use that Russian money to defend itself. That would be a big blow to Putin. And the other thing, of course, that needs to be done is the U.S. House of Representatives needs to approve the $60 billion aid package for Ukraine that was already approved in the Senate. If we don't do those things, then Putin will literally get away with murder.
And then what about for the opposition movement within Russia itself? Do you think that it's able to recover from the loss of such a prominent leader?
I think it's going to be very tough for the opposition leader in Russia, for the opposition movement in Russia for the time being, because, again, Putin has very complete control. But we should not assume that control will last forever any more than the Soviet Union lasted forever. Tyranny always comes to an end sooner or later. And I think the best way to hasten the demise of this evil Putin regime in Russia is to defeat the Putin regime in Ukraine. A military defeat in Ukraine would be a sharp blow to Putin, and it would dent his standing at home and could conceivably lead others in the Kremlin to look for different leaders for the future. Whereas if Putin wins in Ukraine, he's going to be strengthened at home, but also abroad. And he's going to be a much greater threat, not only to Europe, but to his own people.
And then just briefly, Max, what about the upcoming election in Russia? What will Navalny's death mean for that?
Well, the upcoming election, quote unquote, is a joke. Obviously, it's not a real election. There's no choice. There was one anti-war candidate, and Putin refused to let him on the ballot. And now he may very well have killed Navalny, even though Navalny wasn't able to run. But nevertheless, Putin may be eliminating all opposition ahead of this sham election. So it's obviously not on the level. It's obviously not a real election. And I think it's very hard to know what people in Russia are actually thinking beneath the surface, because I'm sure there is actually a lot of discontent, but it's very hard to express that openly, because you see what happens to people who challenge Putin. They either wind up in jail or in the morgue.
Max Boot, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a columnist for The Washington Post. Thank you so much for speaking to us here on DW.